Hello, my name is Renee Effield. The purpose for today's recording is for the Week 15 Assessment Oral Presentation Draft for the subject Human Rights in Certificate 4 for Tertiary Preparation. The human rights issue in Australia I have chosen to discuss is Indigenous Australian education, its failing and its progression throughout our national history. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. A better understanding and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture develops an enriched appreciation of Australia's cultural heritage and can lead to reconciliation. This is essential to the maturity of Australia as a nation and fundamental to the development of an Australian identity. Article 14 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples declares that Indigenous people have the right to establish and control education in their own language and appropriate to their cultural teaching and learning methods. It follows on to declare that Indigenous peoples have the right to all levels and forms of state-developed and provided education, and where possible in their own language and appropriate to their culture without discrimination. Little to no formal education was offered to Indigenous peoples during and prior to early federation in Australia. Aboriginals were looked upon as feral and unclean and unworthy of investing any time into educate. Blatant racism. Children and babies were frequently stolen from their homes, so they also lost education in traditional Indigenous ways of life and cultural experiences. The 1940s saw the limited schooling on offer extended to grade 8. Indigenous students were taught only enough common sense to go out as workers and understand white bosses. Aboriginal people would often feel like they were at the bottom of an insurmountable educational mountain. Prior to 1967, Indigenous schooling had been provided by religious missions, special schools and government agencies. Any education on offer was purely British in orientation, with no acknowledgement of Australian Aboriginal culture. In the 1970s, the National Aboriginal Education Committee was established, rewriting the rules for Indigenous education. This organisation is now giving way to the broader banner organisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC. Since the 1980s, TAFE has increased programs for Aboriginal people and appears to have the most to offer for people striving to overcome educational deficiencies. Specialist tertiary institutions are now being created for Indigenous students, and universities are developing specialist faculties for Aboriginal students. In primary and secondary government schools, specific educational programs for Indigenous students are being introduced to work in conjunction with standard education. A prime example of this are the outstanding efforts being made at Mossvale High School in New South Wales. Please take the time to watch the YouTube video, Our Ways, Effective Practice in Aboriginal Education in New South Wales Public School. It's well worth your time to watch. A primary educational difficulty facing Indigenous speaking students in Australia is the comprehension of what is being taught if English is their second language. Being bilingual can often delay their learning capabilities if a suitable education program isn't available for them. By combining cultural heritage with modern education, students can learn English and achieve better literacy. Millie Wangasandi, an Indigenous elder, stated that we must be strong in both cultures. Equally, English as first language Indigenous students also suffer similar learning difficulties. Poor levels of literacy, numeracy, achievement, and school attendance are inhibiting progression to higher levels of education. Some reasons Indigenous students don't stay in school are unengaging curriculum, health problems, unfriendly environment, and finances. But aren't all school students exposed to these things? Why does it affect Aboriginal students most? This is a very sore sticking point with some non-Indigenous Australians who can't comprehend why, when all students experience these things, that Aboriginal students get supposed special treatment. Education progression rates are lowest in remote Australian locations for Indigenous students. Factors contributing to this are said to include lack of educational resources and problems with retaining teachers. Indigenous adults are often unable to help with their child's education as they have also had poor educational opportunities. Although progressively more Indigenous students are staying on to the higher levels of secondary education, the levels for completion are much lower than those for non-Indigenous students. There is the argument that these levels are low due to the lack of investment by the government into Aboriginal educational programs. To combat this poor performance, we need to investigate building staff and student knowledge about Aboriginal culture, histories and experiences. Making connections and building relationships with the Aboriginal community will allow the seeking of advice and better cultural understanding. The Australian school curricula lacks interest and breadth for Indigenous students. Embracing and placing value in the Aboriginal culture will hopefully allow for the building of students' self-esteem and their ability to see an academically successful future for themselves. According to a Sydney University lecturer, Aboriginal students see university as a place to go to learn how to be less Aboriginal. Maybe this accounts for why only 1% of the university population is Indigenous. Indigenous students do still unfortunately suffer the effects of racism. making them feel second-rate and unworthy of advancement. By investing in Indigenous culture, mentoring, and leadership, students can be part of a community, not isolated, and have the confidence to become better than what they think they are. The whole Australian population can benefit from further education into our Indigenous culture. Equality rules. The only dumb person where the lack of education has occurred is the person doing the denial of the education. No person should feel unworthy. Everybody is entitled to an equal level of education.